Let me tell you what happened in my courtroom. He walked in here looking like he owned the courthouse. Custom-tailored Italian suit, a watch that could probably pay off a standard mortgage, and a legal team that looked like they were dressed for a hostile corporate takeover rather than a standard divorce settlement. Richard Sterling, a luxury real estate developer. He was exactly the kind of man who evaluates everything in a room by its price tag, and unfortunately, that included the people in his life. From the moment he took his seat at the table, he wore this insufferable, mocking smirk. You know the exact look I am talking about. It is the look of a man who believes his bank account makes him legally invincible, absolutely certain he had already won before the bailiff even called the room to order, before I even had the chance to sit down and review the docket. Across the aisle sat his wife, Emily. She was quiet, her hands folded neatly over a worn manila folder. She didn't have a team of corporate sharks in $1,000 suits whispering in her ear. She had one exhausted-looking attorney. Emily was a pediatric nurse, the kind of woman who had spent her entire adult life caring for others, leaving very little energy for herself. She looked drained, like she hadn't slept properly in months. But beneath that profound exhaustion, there was a quiet, unyielding composure. The specific kind of composure, built from years of holding your tongue while living with a man who constantly tries to make you feel small. If you had walked into my courtroom that morning without reading a single brief, you would have seen a classic, tragic mismatch. Wealthy, aggressive husband versus a modest, financially outgunned wife. I have seen this exact dynamic play out thousands of times from this bench. But Richard Sterling's specific brand of arrogance irritated me the very second he opened his mouth. He leaned back in his chair, whispering and chuckling with his lawyers, completely dismissing the gravity of the courtroom and the destruction of his own marriage. In my decades of experience, I have learned one universal truth. People who are telling the truth are respectful, sometimes a little nervous. People who are trying to pull a fast one are overly confident, treating the law like a game they have already rigged. Richard was practically glowing with smugness. He thought this was going to be a quick, clean sweep. He was entirely focused on taking everything they had built together, but most importantly, he was obsessively fixated on taking one specific, separate asset just to spite her, a seemingly barren, 20-acre plot of land left to Emily by her late father. Richard had spent years mocking her father, and he thought that land was completely worthless. He thought he was just taking it to twist the knife and leave her with nothing. He had absolutely no idea what he was actually trying to steal. Before I dive into the specifics of that morning and the catastrophic miscalculation Richard Sterling made, you need to understand how a pediatric nurse and a luxury real estate mogul ended up in this toxic dynamic. It is the same old story I have seen from this bench time and time again. Predators do not show you their teeth on the first date. If they did, you would turn around and run. Instead, they show you charm. They show you a meticulously crafted illusion of security and love. When Emily met Richard 5 years ago, she was grieving. Her father, a blue-collar mechanic who had spent 40 years up to his elbows in engine grease just to put her through nursing school, had recently passed away. He left her with a modest savings account, an unbreakable moral compass, and 20 acres of undeveloped, overgrown land out in the county. Richard swept in when she was vulnerable. He was intensely attentive, and he promised to take care of her. He played the role of the protective provider flawlessly. But the moment the wedding rings were on, the mask began to slip. It started with small, insidious comments. He would complain about the smell of hospital sanitizer on her clothes, subtly suggesting her career as a nurse was somehow lesser than his high-stakes real estate deals. When she talked about the sick children she helped save, he would check his expensive watch, completely disinterested. He slowly isolated her, making her feel that her only real value was being a quiet, smiling accessory to his wealthy lifestyle. The most despicable part, however, was how he spoke about her late father. Richard came from generational wealth. He measured a man's worth strictly by his investment portfolio. He constantly belittled Emily's background. "Your dad was a sweet guy, Emily, but he lacked vision," Richard would say, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. "Working with your hands is for people who can't work with their brains." He treated her grief as an annoyance, a sign of weakness. And that 20-acre plot of land her father left her? Richard called it the dirt patch. He laughed at it constantly. He would tell his wealthy friends at dinner parties that his father-in-law's grand legacy to the world was a glorified mud puddle. He eroded her confidence day by day, year by year, until she barely recognized herself. But what Richard failed to understand What men like him always fail to understand is that a father's protective love doesn't just vanish because he is gone. A father's protective love does not just vanish because he is gone. In fact, Robert Sterling's love was built into the very foundation of Emily's life, and Richard was about to hit that foundation at 100 miles an hour. The breaking point for Emily came on a Tuesday evening in November. She had just finished a grueling 1-2-hour shift at the Children's Hospital and came home exhausted, looking for a moment of peace. Instead, she found Richard in his study, the door slightly ajar. He was on speakerphone with his business partner, Greg, pouring himself a drink and laughing loudly. Emily stopped in the hallway. "I'm telling you, Greg, it's almost too easy," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension. "She's so naive. She actually thinks I'm holding on to that dirt patch out in the county out of respect for her father's memory." Greg laughed on the other end. "I've had the surveyors out there twice," Richard continued. "That land sits right on top of a massive aquifer. It's the key to the entire new luxury golf course development we've been planning. It's worth at least $8 million to the right buyer. And since she put my name on the deed when we consolidated our assets to buy this house, I'm going to take it in the divorce. I'll give her a modest cash settlement and walk away with the golden ticket." Emily stood frozen, her heart hammered in her chest. Everything snapped into agonizing clarity. The sudden insistence on combining their assets a year ago, the casual way he had slid a stack of legal documents in front of her to sign, assuring her it was just standard procedure for tax purposes. He hadn't just been emotionally abusing her. He had been meticulously laying the groundwork to steal the only thing she had left of her father. She didn't confront him that night. She didn't scream or throw anything. She quietly walked backward, slipped out the front door, and sat in her car in the driveway for an hour, tears streaming down her face. The next morning, while Richard was at the office, Emily called in sick. She went to the bank, she went to the county clerk's office, and then she went straight to Margaret Willis, the sharpest, most relentless family law attorney she could find. When Emily laid out the situation, the emotional abuse, the recording she had secretly made of his phone call the next day confirming his plan, the true value of the land, Margaret didn't show pity. She showed a predatory kind of focus. "He thinks he's outsmarted you," Margaret said, reviewing the deed. "He thinks his money makes him untouchable. But we have something better than money, Emily. We have your father." Margaret Willis didn't waste a single moment. She immediately launched a quiet, comprehensive investigation into Richard Sterling's finances, pulling every record, every transaction, every corporate filing she could legally access. What she found was a labyrinth of shell companies and hidden assets. Richard hadn't just been planning to steal the land. He had been systematically siphoning marital funds into private accounts for the past 2 years, preparing for the day he would finally discard Emily. When the final hearing was set, Richard walked into my courtroom with that insufferable smirk, completely unaware of the absolute buzzsaw he was about to walk into. His lead attorney, a slick, overconfident man named Vance, stood up and presented their case. Vance painted a picture of a generous, successful husband who was willing to offer his wife a more than fair cash settlement, provided he kept the primary residence, the investment portfolios, and almost as an afterthought, the small, undeveloped parcel of land out in the county, which Vance claimed Richard needed to offset the marital debt he was graciously assuming. I sat there, listening to this rehearsed performance, watching Richard nod, along with an expression of manufactured solemnity. He looked like a man who thought he had executed the perfect crime. He believed his power, his influence, and his expensive legal team had made him untouchable. Then, I turned to Emily's side. Margaret Willis stood up. She didn't have a flashy presentation or a booming voice. She had a thick stack of manila folders. She approached the bench and began laying out the facts, methodically, clinically, and with devastating precision. She didn't start with the emotional abuse. She started with the numbers. Margaret presented the geological surveys of the land. She presented the aquifer data. She presented the internal corporate memos from Richard's own development company, detailing their desperate need for that specific parcel of land to secure water rights for their multi-million-dollar golf course project. She presented the independent appraisal, valuing the worthless dirt patch at $8.5 million. I watched Richard Sterling's smirk evaporate instantly. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he was going to pass out right there at the defense table. His attorney, Vance, started scrambling through his notes, stammering objections that held absolutely no legal weight. The illusion of the untouchable billionaire was shattering in real time. But Margaret Willis wasn't finished. Margaret Willis didn't just bring the appraisal. She brought the entire, undeniable paper trail. She calmly approached the bench and placed a thick stack of bank statements in front of me that mapped out exactly where Richard's lost marital funds had been disappearing to for the last 24 months. Offshore accounts, Shell LLCs registered in Delaware under his brother's name, mysterious consulting fees, all meticulously designed to artificially deflate his net worth right before he dropped the divorce papers on the kitchen table. He had intentionally engineered a financial drought in their shared accounts so he could claim hardship, cry poor, and justify taking Emily's inheritance to balance the scales. I looked down at the documents, and then I looked up at Richard Sterling. The transformation was absolute. The man who had walked into my courtroom looking like he was ready for a luxury magazine cover shoot was now visibly sweating through his custom-tailored collar. His aggressive, high-priced lawyers were dead silent. They charge $800 an hour, and not a single one of them had a word to say. Fraud is a very difficult thing to defend when the undeniable proof is sitting right on the judge's bench. I looked at him directly and asked a very simple question. Mr. Sterling, when you asked your wife to sign the deed of her late father's property over to your joint trust, did you explicitly inform her that your company had already assessed the land for an $8.5 million commercial project? He stammered. The smooth, polished real estate mogul suddenly couldn't put a coherent sentence together. He cleared his throat. He tugged nervously at his silk tie. Your Honor, he started, his voice cracking slightly. Business projections are highly speculative. It was just a preliminary survey. My wife doesn't understand commercial zoning or the complexities of real estate development. I stopped him right there. I have absolutely zero tolerance for a man who tries to mask his own deceit with condescension. She doesn't need to understand commercial zoning. Mr. Sterling, I told him, my voice carrying through the silent room. She only needs to understand that her husband is a fraud. You sat in this courtroom and tried to convince me that this property was a worthless dirt patch you were generously taking off her hands. You deliberately and maliciously concealed material facts to orchestrate the theft of her inheritance. You could hear a pin drop in that courtroom. Emily sat perfectly still on her side of the aisle, her hands no longer tightly clenched. The profound exhaustion that had clouded her face had been completely replaced by something else entirely clarity. She was watching the man who had spent 5 years systematically convincing her she was small, uneducated, and insignificant shrink into a pathetic, stammering shadow of himself. And we were just getting to the best part of the morning. In my courtroom, when you commit deliberate financial fraud, you do not just lose the specific asset you were trying to steal. You lose the entire legal protective shield you spent years building around yourself. Richard Sterling's legal team, those high-priced corporate sharks who had walked in looking like they owned the building, suddenly looked like they wanted to be anywhere else on the planet. They wouldn't even make eye contact with their own client. They knew exactly what was coming. I looked down at the irrefutable mountain of evidence Margaret Willis had meticulously assembled: the geological surveys, the internal corporate memos, the offshore bank statements, and I didn't just deny Richard's request to keep the land. I took a metaphorical legal sledgehammer to his entire financial empire. I ruled that the initial consolidation of their assets, the specific legal document Richard had casually slipped under Emily's nose a year prior under the guise of standard tax purposes, was fundamentally fraudulent. It was signed under deliberate deception and malice. Because of that, the entire agreement was completely voided. The 20-acre property with the massive aquifer, I declared it entirely and exclusively Emily's separate, non-marital property. Richard Sterling would not see a single dime of that $8.5 million valuation. But I absolutely did not stop there. Because Richard had deliberately attempted to hide marital funds in offshore Shell LLCs registered under his brother's name, I awarded Emily a disproportionately large share of their remaining marital assets. She was awarded the primary residence, the sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate Richard loved to show off to his wealthy friends. She was awarded half of all his verifiable investment accounts, and, as a final, necessary measure of justice, I ordered Richard Sterling to personally pay every single cent of Emily's legal fees and court costs. Every single hour Margaret Willis spent brilliantly unraveling his deceit was going to be billed directly to his account. When I brought down the gavel, the sharp sound echoed like a gunshot in that perfectly silent room. Richard Sterling literally slumped into his chair. His pristine, custom-tailored Italian suit suddenly looked like it was 2 sizes too big for him. The arrogant, untouchable real estate mogul who measured every human being's worth by their bank account, had just been financially gutted by the very woman he had spent 5 years actively trying to diminish. He looked utterly broken, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table, the reality of his profound failure finally sinking in. But the most powerful moment of that morning wasn't Richard's spectacular collapse. It was looking across the room at Emily. While Richard's entire financial world was collapsing around him, I watched Emily. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile that arrogant, insufferable smile Richard had worn when he walked in. She simply sat there, taking a deep, slow breath, like someone who had been holding it underwater for 5 years and had finally broken the surface. She stood up slowly, picking up her worn manila folder. Richard, still looking like he had been hit by a freight train, suddenly snapped out of his shock. He lunged across the aisle, his voice desperate, stripped of all its former polish. "Emily, wait," he pleaded, grabbing her wrist. "We can work this out. I was just trying to secure our future. You know how business is. You know I love you." It was a pathetic display. This man, who had spent 5 years treating her like an incompetent accessory, who had laughed at her grief and mocked her humble father, was now begging because she held the keys to the kingdom. He didn't love her. He loved his golf course, his bank accounts, and his power. And now that he had lost them all, he was trying to play the victim. Emily didn't yell. She didn't cause a scene. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, and then she looked him dead in the eye with a terrifying, absolute calm. "I heard you on the phone, Richard," she said softly, but her voice carried through the silent courtroom. "I heard you call me naive. I heard you call my father's land a dirt patch. You thought you were so much smarter than me. You thought because my dad wore grease on his hands, he didn't know how to protect his daughter." She pulled her wrist out of his grasp. "You were wrong. About my father, about the land, and especially about me." She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, leaving Richard Sterling completely alone with the wreckage of his own arrogance. His lawyers were already packing their briefcases, not even waiting for him to follow. The aftermath of that single morning in court was total and complete devastation for Richard Sterling. He lost the $8.5 million land that he thought was a worthless dirt patch. He lost the multi-million-dollar primary residence. He lost half his verifiable investment portfolio, and he was hit with a legal bill that likely required him to liquidate whatever assets he still had left just to keep his own aggressive lawyers from suing him. But more importantly than the money, Richard lost his power. He had spent his entire life believing that wealth insulated him from consequence, that he could manipulate the law and the people around him without ever facing a reckoning. The moment Margaret Willis laid those bank statements and land appraisals on my desk, that illusion shattered permanently. He walked into my courtroom as a titan of luxury real estate, and he walked out as an exposed fraud. Emily, on the other hand, walked out holding the future her father had spent 40 years building for her. That blue-collar mechanic, the man Richard constantly belittled for working with his hands, had secured a piece of land that ensured his daughter would never have to rely on a man who didn't respect her. From beyond the grave, Emily's father had outsmarted the slick, Silicon Valley real estate mogul. I have seen countless power dynamics in my time on the bench. I have seen every variety of manipulation, every kind of financial scheme, and every type of arrogant narcissist who believes the rules do not apply to them. But cases like this stay with me because they remind me of the absolute core principle of justice. Power and privilege might buy you a custom suit, an expensive watch, and a team of cutthroat lawyers. It might allow you to build a convincing illusion for a few years. But when you step into a courtroom, when the facts are laid bare and the evidence is irrefutable, power fails. And when power fails, character is the only thing that remains. Richard Sterling had none, and it cost him everything. Emily's father had character in spades, and it saved her. Next time you see someone abusing their power, someone hiding behind a wealthy name or an expensive title, remember Arthur Vance. Remember the day privilege collapsed under the weight of the truth. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. We post brand new, unbelievable stories just like this one every single day. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, and I will see you in the next video. That is what happened in my courtroom, and I would not have had it any other way. Bye.